Hello. So today's topic it's about the game that I released recently called House underscore demo, and thought we would talk a little bit about the journey. Um, okay, so let's start from the beginning. Well, I think it starts from the idea that we all dream and that dreams are really like an endless source of creativity and inspiration and truth. More specifically, let's talk a bit about my inspirations as a kid. So, I grew up in the 90s, played a lot of PlayStation, SNES, Game Boy Color, and the games I was playing for those collectively, Super Metroid was probably one of my biggest, most vivid memories of games growing up. That one really left a mark, and I loved the nature of no narrative and no hand holding. Then there was games like Mega Man Legends for the PS1. That game, I remember just exploring the map and hearing the birds in the background of the various fields, and then the dungeons. There's that kind of ominous like white noise, kind of something about it just resonated or got me. And there was also a game called Nameco Museum. It features a very interesting overworld, we could call it. That's just a museum that you end up going into different rooms that feature different arcade games from the early days. And I obviously liked playing the games like Galaga and whatnot, but I really liked going from one game to the next inside of the museum. It had this interesting music playing in the background and a really neat aesthetic. And yeah, I would just enjoy walking around the museum and looking at the different like pictures that they had of old like arcade cabinets and whatnot. So yeah, those things seeped into my deep memories. And obviously for Game Boy Color, Link's Awakening, huge inspiration. And then something about the music and the art and everything in those games, they really they sunk in. I really liked the kind of jungly drum and bass electronic music that they were playing in a lot of those PS1 games. I just remember having those in my head, like looping. Need for Speed, I think it was High Stakes. The soundtrack in that game was great. But there was something about some of the tunes and some of the loops and in those early games that had a really nice ambient kind of experimental electronic, kind of like Brian Eno vibe to those soundscapes. Yeah, that I liked. It wasn't just like all in your face, or all in your just trying to be like super extreme. It was a little bit more contemplative and nice, and I appreciated that as a kid. It led me to want to make art and make music and imagining. I was always imagining. And later on, toward the end of high school, started to realize like that I really enjoyed drawing and making stuff on the computer, and then got into GarageBand and started making loops, and I fell in love with that. And so in late high school, when I was taking a graphic design class, that's kind of when I got into making art using Photoshop and Flash and GarageBand. I was we had Max, and it was great. But there were people that were making animations, and then I think my teacher was saying how you could use Flash to make games, and I remember thinking that was it, and to make like user interfaces and everything, and everything that I saw on the computer was handled, all those animations through programming. And I was like, I didn't think that was for me. It seemed a little too complicated, and I was just focused on the art side. But then later on, when I was in art school, yeah, I was getting comfortable making art, and I was making music in Ableton and exploring that, and it was a lot of fun. And I was thinking about making a game, seriously, like starting to like explore the options that were available back then, which, mid 2010s. Flash was still around, Unity, other 2D game makers, and I was gravitating toward 2D at the time. And I had already had some experience in Flash, so I thought, okay, maybe I'll make a little game in Flash. So I made a little point and click game called Boy World. Yeah, that was interesting. I used ActionScript, which was the programming language for Flash, and it was kind of difficult at the time to get information. I was following some tutorials, I guess. Really had no clue what I was doing, but eventually I figured out the idea of like you make objects that do something when you click them, in Boy World it was just basically a bunch of doors that you would click it, the boy would go walk to wherever it was that you clicked. I animated him walking toward each door, and if it was like click on this door, that animation would play, and then that would trigger the next scene, and I'd have a different kind of a thing that would happen in that, and kind of in the nature of obviously point and click, but I liked the rooms idea and doors and exploring these kind of like spaces. And this was before back rooms and liminal spaces. I guess they've always existed, but that idea, it resonates with me. It always has, because it's very similar to how dreams feel, which is my core, I think, inspiration. I've been realizing that more and more lately, that dreams are the thing that seem to inform a lot of my creative decision making. Anyways, so I made that little Flash game. It was very random, there wasn't a lot of logic to the progression. It was just the one room that had several doors and some other little various things you could click on, and you would see a little animation or whatever. But and I wanted to explore it more, and I just got too overwhelmed by the difficulty of programming. Yeah, that's always been something in the back of my head, is I'm not really like a programmer. It seems like a super math heavy, and I didn't do very well in math as a kid. It wasn't something that I was good at. I think I'm more of a right-brained creative person, if the right-left brain thing is real. Yeah, just very overwhelmed and very intimidated by programming. And I think it's very relatable. Programming is a very hard thing to grasp. It's very abstract. I wanted to see it more so. I wanted to have maybe like a visual way of programming, and I think there was Scratch and a couple other game makers that had that kind of code blocks that you would drag, connect to one another. And I thought, and at the time that seemed like it was nice, but I put programming off for a while and just focused on making art, because that's what I feel more comfortable and feels more intuitive, natural. But always in the back of my mind thinking that to make a game, something that is interesting, I think, about games in general is that they're, the perfect kind of marriage between visual art, music, storytelling, animation, and having it all be interactive. It's this like ultimate kind of like tool for creative expression. And so yeah, games and programming, intimidation. I think something that is intimidating as well about making games is that it's hard to like define what you want to make, and the scope kind of getting out of control, feeling like a little idea can turn into a really big idea if you're not careful, and then that gets really overwhelming. And then there's this kind of like I would end up feeling every time I kind of like wanted to approach that topic, like I'd get really overwhelmed thinking like there's just too many things I have to juggle and think about. And programming, is scary, and making a ton of art and having to like have all these things interact, and having like a big game document that I'd have to come up with first. And it all seemed very like overwhelming. But on the idea of scope, I Yeah, because growing up, it seemed like there's all these AAA games, indie game development. I caught wind of that at one point. Obviously, there was the indie game movie that I watched, and that term indie games, indie developers, solo developers, people making games by themselves. Um, there were several that I saw these people making games, and I was like by themselves, making the art, the music, and they would make these games, and a lot of them felt like so much better to me than the AAA kind of games. More creative, more inspired. I don't know. I just fell in love with that idea of making games kind of by yourself, like solo indie game development. I also caught wind of itch.io. Something that was super cool about that website is how it was just so accessible. Like a lot of games on itch.io are like free. You can sometimes even play them in on the web browser, and but you can quickly delve into all of these genres and all of these interesting little games that kind of opened up my awareness of the scope of games, and how you can make games that are big, like very, very expansive, very intricate, or you can make very simple games, and they can be really like compelling. And eventually, just exploring through itch.io, I came across this game jam called LSD Jam. Learned about a game called LSD Dream Emulator, and it was a game that was so ahead of its time. It came out for the PS1, and I don't think it was very well received, but it was very experimental. It was more of a, I would say, interactive art kind of experiment, less of a game. And I could definitely imagine at the time people who had a PlayStation and would buy, play something like that would be a little bit weirded out. It's a very strange kind of a dream, obviously tripped out dream experience. And I that's kind of like it just fit exactly with everything that mattered to me playing games, especially getting older and not really wanting to have all these missions that I have to accomplish, and to kill a bunch of things, and to have I feel like just to have an experience where you're in a world and you get to explore it, and you don't have to listen to anybody or do anything that, kill anything that's in your way, like you're just there, you're just experiencing what's there. And I love that idea, and it seemed very approachable as well, or very like doable to have a little, first person camera, build out the world and the assets and the sounds, the loops, the music. I was like thinking, I could definitely get there. It seemed a lot less daunting and gave me this kind of motivation. I was looking into options. I originally was getting into Unity, and yeah, Unity, for whatever reason, that never like meshed very well for me. There was Unreal, that seemed too big and too like the user interface, and just the endless amount of things that you can do in that engine just seemed like what professionals use, or like what big studios use. It didn't seem like it would even run on my computer back then. It was very heavy. And then I learned about Godot, and thought that seemed like a really nice game engine. Very lightweight, no licensing, or just a open source free option. But and it has its own programming language, which is GDScript, and it's very similar to Python, which I think GDScript it seems like a pretty understandable language, but it's still like all the tutorials I was watching, I still was hitting a block. Okay, we're back. So yeah, I was hitting a block with the programming part still, even though I knew now all I needed was a couple things to be interactive. I didn't need to go too out of control, just some simple ability to interact with things and play sounds and play animations and go from level to level and that kind of thing. I had to go about learning programming, like legit programming, and get serious about it. Something that I saw was that GDQuest, which is an amazing resource, amazing YouTube videos, and the people behind that channel made a little kind of a game or like interactive learning GD script thing on itch.io that I ended up playing, and it was interesting because by the end of it, I distinctly remember this kind of like light bulb moment going off where I realized I was writing the code. I wasn't referencing anything. I was just, it just clicked, because with GDQuest, it feels like the way that they explain things, for me, clicked, because it was explaining all of every little detail, like, and why those details matter, and going from kind of a very simple everyday way of describing the programming like concepts, that weren't like abstract math concepts. It was more like more applicable for me. And so I had this like light bulb moment, and I was like, I've never had that with programming before. And that gave me a really huge like confidence and motivation boost to know that like it was possible. They're developing a courses where you can learn 2D and 3D game development with Godot. And I ended up purchasing that, and I would highly recommend going with either one. The 2D option, I think, is enough to, I would say I'm like up to the part where you make like a little top-down game with a little character that runs in a maze and gets chased by an AI. I feel like if you can get to that point and things are making sense, and I started to like make little games myself, a little more like interaction sort of things with UI, which to me seemed very like easy to apply the knowledge that I was getting from those courses. And I started to like realize like I could do this without having to rely on tutorials, because it was making sense foundationally. It was making sense how you can interact with different nodes or different components. Okay, so then I'm getting more confidence with programming, more confident. Now I want to try to approach the idea of making making a game. I don't have any kind of comprehension about like, how or what. It just LSD Dream Emulator. That's my motivation. And so I want to develop a workflow, an efficient workflow of just making assets easily enough to have it be something where I could kind of more or less go on autopilot, because the core of my workflow, I've realized this more and more lately, is that it's about just doing, less about planning, less about having some predefined kind of like script or checklist for me to go off of, and more about following this kind of organic, creative, one thing leads to the next journey, where each decision is kind of informing the next. So yeah, I've developed kind of a good process for myself as far as making assets, like can ideate with sketching very quickly, where 3D modeling, 3D work in general is a lot more methodical and technical. So it's nice to start out with sketch things out. And anybody can do that. It's easy to pick up some paper or use your computer and just sketch things and come up with like a lot of interesting ideas. For the process, I'll say with how my game or demo came about was just this idea, the sketch that I had made of a house, a really simple sketch, and it was enough to kind of make me think, okay, all right, now how can I make this interactable? How can I make this into a game? How can I like go into that house, and what would be in the house, and blah 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 blah. There's, you know, all the things that spiraled from that one little sketch. I did the sketch, and then I figured out, okay, I need to model a house, and pretty comfortable with Blender, but even still, I struggle with the idea of using box modeling, traditional like hard surface modeling for assets. To me has always been a bit limiting and not very intuitive. So I somehow came along sign distance field modeling, where you basically have these shapes that you can have one shape and another shape, and they'll combine with one another. If you have them overlapping, they will seamlessly blend into one another, kind of like how voxel, what is it called? 3D coat. Yeah, 3D coat. But with SDF modeling, and there's a great free software called SDF Modeler. Yeah, that is a super simple program, but it just like, it feels like you can fly through making assets, and I was able to make a house asset with that pretty easily. You know, just taking cubes, and everything's non-destructive, so I can take cubes and subtract them from one another or add them to one another and have everything just kind of seamlessly blend together and fit. And so before I knew it, I had a nice layout for a house, and I modeled some furniture quickly, and modeled a faucet, modeled a button, a lot of things. And so yeah, that was a really nice, it's such a great workflow. I highly recommend it for people wanting to get into 3D but don't want to have to deal with topology and extrusions and whatever. But speaking of topology, you know, with game development, you have to kind of be a little mindful of how many polygons your meshes are made out of, because the more there are, the more your game engine will struggle to render all of those polygons in real time. So, and with sign distance field modeling, when you export those models, they are incredibly dense, with not usable in a traditional way with games. So like unless you're using Nanite or something in Unreal, then you don't need to worry about topology. But the nice thing in Blender is you can take a really bad, like super dense piece of a model with like high topology and use the decimate modifier. I have a method of using two decimate modifiers. One that uses the unsubdivide, and I lower that to like 0.1 or so, and then add a second decimate modifier set to planar. If, you know, like the asset has a lot of flat faces and you don't need to have any like vertices on the face, it can be a flat single face, then the planar decimate after the first unsubdivide modifier cleans it up pretty nicely. And then you can use weighted normals modifier if you need to clean up the normals and have them look not as like wonky, a little more uniform. And then you can apply all those and you have yourself like a pretty okay mesh. It's not like super great, but it's good enough and quick, really quick. And then you can easily UV those and add materials. And for my materials, I just use super low res screen grabs of different textures of like wood and cloth and different things that work really well, give like a really nice like PlayStation 1 aesthetic, and not to have to be like PBR. You know, you can do roughness, but like I wasn't worried about adding normal maps or displacement or anything like that. Just nice flat textures, and the real world textures too, of like actual photographs of things give a nice a hint of realism. Yeah, it's amazing how much a low resolution screen grab can add to the immersion of a space. Anyways, so yeah, I was putting all that together. I have, was have my like workflow in Bitwig, making loops. I have my nice MIDI controller, and I can sequence beats and loops and stuff. Like I don't have to think very hard about that. It's pretty nice, and I can make a video about that at some point. But and my 2D art that I can incorporate into the 3D with in the way of like either textures or UI elements. So yeah, that's kind of a nice marriage of all of the art. So now moving on. Yeah, now I have everything together more or less. I have my house. Now I need to make it interactive and put it into a game engine. And I start out with Godot, and things are working out pretty well. I make my little first person character, and I add like a little interactive element, to be able to interact with, say, like a door or any other object. And this is a good topic about programming that is, I think, something that I wish made. It took me a while to understand it, and now that I understand it better, I think it seems to open up a lot for me in the world of like programming, and it seems a lot less daunting when you understand. It's the idea of the object-oriented programming and parenting and classes and having things that relate to one another, kind of from a parent-child relationship, and how the parent can have a bunch of things that it does, but then the child can inherit those things. Like, and I know that already sounds probably really confusing, but the more I started to think about it and actually applying it in some of my interactive elements, where I have one interact class, and then I'm able to call that class on a bunch of different objects, and it's like a lot less work than having to to make an interactive element from scratch every time for each object, which, so on the topic of making things more less daunting, it's nice to have things like a class or an interface in something like Unreal, where you make one thing and you have it like propagate or execute on a lot of other things. So let me figure out a better way to phrase it. With a class or an interface, you're able to save yourself a lot of work, and less work equals more fun, more creativity, less difficult, hair pulling kind of things. But it's just important. I guess it was important for me to understand like why that makes sense, and eventually it did. And if I could understand it, if I could do it, then I think anybody can. So yeah, I was starting to put everything together in Godot. But something that was really bothering me was the things weren't looking right. I wasn't like matching what I had in my head of like bounce lighting. I'm pretty spoiled nowadays with a lot of the global illumination that you can have nowadays in real time with things like Unreal, and I remember in art school learning that that's kind of the secret sauce, is to have your main light, but then have whatever that main light is bouncing off of hitting maybe like the underside of like a face. So you have your head lit from the top, and then you've got that main light hitting a surface that's under the face that bounces up and, creates this more depth, but also more just like visual interest. And I really need that. I needed that for my vision for this game. I needed the global illumination. I just was curious what my assets would look like in Unreal. And mind you, I was using Linux for all of this, all of my everything up until then. I made all the assets, all the music, all the art on Linux. And with Godot, it runs natively on Linux. It's great. But I also know that you can use Unreal in on Linux. So I gave it a shot. I opened it up. I opened up the engine and imported my assets, and they looked right. They looked exactly right. And so I was kind of like, shoot, well, and I had dabbled with blueprints before, and I loved the idea that blueprints are visual, and they seem to make so much more sense. But it seems tricky to kind of get to translate something like GD script to blueprints. I wasn't sure how that I wasn't confident in my ability to interpret one language into another that with a completely different approach of visual scripting versus the traditional way of scripting. So I watched a ton of videos and learned kind of the basics of blueprints. There's a really good YouTube video series of videos that I learned from that highly recommend. And so with understanding that and watching them several times, it kind of started to click okay, this is how I could do things. Making interactions using an interface to put onto all of my different interactive elements. I don't need them to do anything crazy. I just need to be able to open a door or click to have something play a sound, something like that. And so I quickly started to be able to do that with blueprints. I was shocked at how fast it was going and how I was able to have an idea and make it happen. It was another kind of light bulb moment for me where I realized I was just flying through the process in Unreal, which I was very surprised by. But granted, I had opened the engine before. I had dabbled in the UI and experimented with things in the past, but very scattered, and spending concentrated effort and several days of just diving in and having questions, but being able to get the answers fairly quickly using, I'll say that I love using AI for getting help with programming, getting help with technical related things. I think AI is seriously one of the better things that I can think of as far as a resource for learning. And the idea that you can have a one-on-one with it, get feedback and give it screenshots and ask questions about why does this thing work or what's the best approach. That's seriously kind of, in addition to learning foundational things and you can't replace learning the foundations. AI eventually can probably just do it all for you if you give it a good prompt or whatever it is. But I think that you should be in the driver's seat. You should do the work, have the creative control, have the do the majority of the work, and have, I think, AI maybe help with troubleshooting, and that's what I've been using. Claude and Perplexity. Google has its AI mode that works pretty well. And I've been using that heavily for in that sort of for this game and for other little mini projects and learning as a learning resource. It would be really difficult without it, but at the same time, it's nice when I understand the foundation through GDQuest or the Blueprints foundational series of videos and other blueprints related videos that and text that I've been able to absorb it and have it sink in and apply it. That's critical, is to apply what you're learning, and as you're doing it, you start to run into the questions, like maybe things don't work exactly right, and you then maybe ask AI, and then you figure out like, okay, that's why, and you fill in the all the blanks with anything that's like missing in your understanding, and rinse and repeat, and you keep doing that. And throughout the course of like several days, I was able to put together a little game, and it was fairly organic. I didn't go in with a big grand idea. It was just the house sketch, build the house, then put the house into a game engine, and then figure out how to make the things interact. And as I was making one thing interact, I would think, okay, for example, the picture frame. I had initially thought like, okay, I'll just leave all the pictures static, but I already had animated the character moving. I'll show a screen grab of that. I had already animated that, and I figured, yeah, might as well make that interactive. That would be kind of sad to have it just be static. But things like having the light switch turn on and off, I kind of just thought that would make sense. And initially I thought, okay, I'll just have the door open on its own, but you got to have a key, so I'll add a key. And then figuring out a way to like end the game, have it have like a nice like game loop, and I needed a way to like exit the game somehow. So I was like, okay, I'll add a path that opens, that exists somehow. And I figured, well, maybe have a button that does that. And so I added that, and it was easy enough to add elements and apply the interface, add the functionality, which was all extraordinarily easy. The other thing about blueprints is just, in programming in general, is just figuring out how to have things communicate with one another. And once you start to get comfortable doing that, then it's like, okay, you know, seems like what can't I do now, rather than like having the reverse issue of like, I have too many ideas and I don't know how to execute, so I am pretty amazed by this whole experience, that after so many years of struggling with the idea of making a game and programming and having things like all work together cohesively, to after only really a few days of like really focused kind of concentration, I was able to make something, and I am still amazed that it's possible, and that's critical. Want everybody to know that it's you could do it too. So I finished all of that. Like I have something that I feel like I want to share now. I feel okay with sharing this. It seems complete for the most part. It's very small, and I want to build off of this in the future. But now I got to publish it. And so meanwhile, I'm on Linux and I'm using Unreal, and I realize that I need to export this as a Windows game. Otherwise, if I just export it as a Linux build, then that's gonna like really limit the amount of people that can experience this and play it. And there's always, when you make a game for Windows, you have the ability to play that game on Linux or Mac with Wine, or Proton. So I needed to figure out how to make the game Windows executable. So you can't traditionally export Windows games on Linux because of licensing, and I was pretty headstrong in wanting to just stay on Linux and not use like a Windows virtual machine or dual boot or do any of that. And I learned the hard way that trying to get the Windows SDK software development kit on Linux, and to compile a GitHub version of Unreal, and install all of the dependencies and all of the libraries. Took hours and hours and hours, literally like 12 hours and like 500 gigabytes worth of downloaded software. And my hard drive was almost full, and I realized, okay, I need to pivot, I need to be flexible, and that's something that's important, it seems like, with game development, is to be flexible about, your approach, where you might think you're gonna, use one engine, and you realize it doesn't maybe have the things that you need. So you might have to explore a different option, or a workflow not being optimized for the way that you work best, what's intuitive for you, So SDF modeling for me is super intuitive. And I had to kind of like figure out what works best for me. And that's very important for everybody else's process, find what's intuitive for you and kind of forge your own path. So I caved, or I realized maybe more what my priorities are. It's less about having this like non-Windows kind of like mentality and open source and Linux and whatever. Like I don't think that's important at all, compared to like what you want to what do you want to do with the software, what do you want to do with the operating system, like. And for me it seems way more beneficial for game development, specifically with Unreal and a lot of other applications that just work better with Windows. There's not a lot of headache when when you just want to run something on Windows. It works, and with Linux there's always a bit of trial and error, and but where there is a will, there's a way, and that's what I really think. I think you need to have a bit of that with game development in particular, is having this like it's possible mindset. When things don't work, that's kind of normal, and it's a constant having to troubleshoot and problem solve. That's critical with learning in general. So embracing that and kind of learning to enjoy that like problem solving and investigation and research and coming up with kind of like multiple different like scenarios that you can kind of be like, all right, I'll test this one way, and if that doesn't work, I'll try another way. So that's what I ended up doing with Windows. I moved to Windows, got the game loaded up in Unreal on Windows, and was able, after a little bit of work, to get all the, even on Windows, I didn't have all of the things I needed to build a game for Windows on Windows, which is odd, but there's a lot of libraries that are needed. To have the Windows SDK, have Visual Studio, have that set up properly, and then with the sigh of relief, I was able to hit publish and have the game exported within a little folder on my computer that I could double click the executable and just have it play, and kind of felt like magic. Still feels like magic. And anyways, future goals, I want to continue to build this idea of an LSD dream emulator, kind of a game where you just explore different places that all have kind of unique, interesting interactions that occur that are very maybe dreamlike. Obviously, yes. So we'll go back to what I said in the beginning, that dreams are truth. it's like distilled truth somehow from all of our experiences that they get transformed into different shapes and different places and a different way of experiencing our reality, but in a way that I feel like even if it's illogical sometimes or very surreal, it's more distilled truth sometimes than even reality can be, where we're always putting on a face or putting on a front, or things are happening in the background all the time that we maybe perceive but we're not aware of. And so I think with dreams they have that potential, or that ability to reveal truths that exist, and so I want to build more games that maybe can tap into that dream-like quality. That's my plan for the future. To make a full game that I could publish on Steam one day, or itch.io, or wherever, just to be able to publish a full game, and to just again say that it's possible. You can make a game. I know it seems really overwhelming. It's like, where do you even start? But just start with something that you enjoy doing, like with drawing or making music, or writing, or taking pictures, and see maybe how you can start to put maybe all those things together, because I think we're all very multifaceted. People are complex, and we have a lot of different interests, and see where maybe you can put those interests together, and to be able to make like to juxtapose all of those different things, and see maybe be surprised at how those things can come together. Be open to the journey of kind of going just with the flow and seeing where things go. I guess that's a good place to call it. And till next time, thank you. And thanks for playing. Thanks for watching. And see you in the future with more fun, good stuff. All right. Thanks. Bye.